We were standing in the kitchen, talking about something ordinary: schedules, commitments, the quiet logistics of a life that still functioned, and she mentioned a plan that had already been set in motion. Not proposed, not discussed, already arranged. I remember nodding instinctively, the way you do when something sounds reasonable, and then feeling the delay catch up to me half a second later. That brief internal pause where I realized I hadn't actually been part of choosing it. Have you ever been sitting next to someone who promised they loved you, and still felt, without proof, without drama, that your place in their life had quietly shifted? That was where this began. Not with an argument, not with betrayal you could point to, just a slow, careful change in how space worked around me. On the surface, my marriage looked steady, adult, cooperative. We didn't fight, we didn't raise our voices. Nothing was wrong in a way that justified concern. And yet, something subtle had started happening. Conversations would move forward without pausing for me. Decisions would be mentioned after they were already shaped. At dinners or family calls, my wife would answer questions meant for both of us, softly, efficiently, before I had finished forming my response. If someone misunderstood my position, she'd smooth it over with a quick explanation instead of letting me speak. Not correcting me, not disagreeing, just adjusting the narrative so things stayed comfortable. I noticed how often she'd say, "What he means is," or "he's fine with whatever works." Even when I hadn't said that. It wasn't malicious. That was the hardest part. It felt helpful, reasonable, adult. But over time, I realized no one was checking whether I actually agreed anymore. My presence became assumed, not engaged. I was there, but no one was waiting on me. I told myself this was just maturity, that this was what long-term partnership looked like when things were stable. But stability shouldn't feel like you're being quietly edited out of your own life. What unsettled me wasn't disagreement, it was how unnecessary my agreement had become. I didn't feel rejected. I felt managed, like my role was to stay cooperative while other people aligned around outcomes that no longer required my input. And slowly, without a single confrontation, I started questioning things I'd never questioned before. Was I being supported, or simply accommodated? Was I being trusted, or just accounted for? Was I still being chosen, or had everyone already learned how to move forward without needing that choice anymore? The unsettling part was that nothing had ended, no one had left, no lines had been crossed, yet something essential had loosened its grip, and I could feel it even if I couldn't name it yet. I didn't understand then that this wasn't the absence of love, it was the beginning of something quieter. Something that doesn't announce itself when it starts. Something you only notice after you realize no one looks at you for confirmation anymore. Have you ever noticed how the smallest misunderstandings don't hurt because they're wrong, but because no one bothers to correct them? And how the moment you stop fixing those misunderstandings isn't peace at all, it's fatigue? That was the week something shifted for me, long before money or family dinners ever entered the picture. When harmless assumptions started forming quietly, comments said casually, interpretations made on my behalf without malice or sharpness, just easy explanations offered before I ever opened my mouth. When her family asked about decisions I'd made, she answered smoothly, confidently, as if she already knew what I would say, helping the room move forward. And the strange part wasn't that she spoke for me, it was that she never looked back to see if I agreed. I told myself it was convenience, that she was smoothing things over, protecting me from unnecessary tension. But every time she explained me, something subtle shifted. I became easier to misunderstand. People stopped asking questions. Assumptions settled faster than curiosity. I noticed it most when I considered correcting the story. Not a confrontation, just a sentence, a clarification. And I didn't hesitate because I doubted the truth. I hesitated because I doubted the cost. Because correcting them wouldn't have caused friction with her family, it would have created it with her. And that realization stayed with me longer than it should have. I began editing myself before conversations even happened, choosing versions of me that required the least explanation. Not out of fear but efficiency. Because I didn't want to disrupt a rhythm she had already established or be the complication in a room that had decided I was simple. Slowly, without anyone announcing it, I stopped being consulted. Decisions were relayed instead of discussed. Opinions summarized instead of requested. And I was still present, still included, still polite. But something essential had shifted. I wasn't being challenged. And I wasn't being defended either. What unsettled me most wasn't disagreement. It was how unnecessary my alignment had become. How no one paused to say, "That's not how he sees it." Not because they disagreed, but because they no longer felt the need to check. And I didn't confront it or question it out loud. I just carried the quiet weight of how easy it had become for everyone, including the person closest to me, to decide who I was without me in the conversation. And that was the first time I asked myself something I'd never needed to ask before: if staying quiet keeps the peace, what exactly am I paying for it, and who benefits when I stop correcting the story? The dinner wasn't hostile, and that's what made it unsettling. Everyone smiled, asked the right questions, passed plates, commented on the food. On the surface, nothing was wrong, but somewhere between the first course and the second, I noticed that conversation started adjusting around me instead of including me. Plans were discussed as if I were adjacent, not present. Questions about the future were phrased broadly, then subtly redirected toward my wife, who answered smoothly, confidently, without checking in. It wasn't dismissive, it was efficient. I was referenced, summarized, translated. When finances came up, it wasn't curiosity, it was calibration. When work was mentioned, it was framed gently, like something provisional. No one challenged me directly. No one needed to. They spoke as if they already understood my limits. And my wife didn't correct them. She didn't defend me, but she didn't betray me either. She did something quieter. She allowed the assumptions to stand because challenging them would have slowed the room down. I could feel it in the way eye contact shifted, in how decisions were phrased as updates rather than questions, in the way my presence stopped shaping the conversation and started being managed within it. At one point, someone joked lightly about long-term stability, and the table laughed in agreement before I could even register what had been implied. I waited for my wife to glance at me, to re-anchor the moment, but she was already responding, already aligning the narrative so the evening stayed comfortable. That's when I realized the loss wasn't happening through conflict, it was happening through coordination. The room wasn't against me, it simply didn't need me, and the most disorienting part wasn't their behavior, it was how natural it all felt to her. She wasn't choosing them over me, she was choosing ease over friction, flow over defense. I sat there nodding, participating just enough to remain polite, while something quietly recalibrated. I wasn't being excluded, I was being placed, and by the time dessert arrived, I understood something that hadn't been clear before: whatever this marriage was becoming, it no longer protected me by default. Not in rooms like this, not when perception mattered more than truth. I left that dinner unchanged in any visible way, but internally, something had shifted. I wasn't angry, I wasn't hurt, I was alert. Because once you realize people are speaking around you instead of to you, and the person who knows you best lets it happen, you stop waiting for a confrontation. You start watching for what comes next. Have you ever been offered something in a way that made refusing feel like you were the problem? That was how it happened, slipped into conversation without ceremony, introduced not as a question but as a solution that assumed agreement before I'd even caught up to it. Her father spoke calmly, confidently, outlining what he believed was best for everyone, using words like support and stability, framing it as a natural next step rather than a decision that required consent. He didn't look at me when he spoke. His gaze stayed level, addressing the room as if my role had already been categorized. I remember noticing how carefully the offer avoided pressure while still carrying weight, how it sounded generous precisely because it left no room for discomfort. It wasn't aggressive, it was efficient. And as the explanation continued, I became aware of something more unsettling than the proposal itself: the absence of interruption. My wife didn't step in. She didn't ask a clarifying question or slow the conversation down. Instead, There was a brief pause, followed by a small nod, subtle enough to be missed by anyone not watching closely. That nod wasn't a decision. It was permission. It signaled that the details didn't need discussion here. That whatever concerns might exist would be handled privately, later, away from the room. And in that instant, something shifted. I wasn't being asked anymore. I was being included quietly. The way you include someone after the outcome is already settled. The conversation flowed forward without resistance, as if alignment had been confirmed upstream. They spoke about timing, convenience, how this would make things easier moving ahead. No one asked whether I wanted ease at this price. I realized then that objection would no longer sound neutral, it would sound disruptive. Refusal wouldn't read as autonomy. It would read as ingratitude. Silence, on the other hand, was being interpreted as agreement. And the most unsettling part wasn't that my voice had been taken, it was that it was no longer required. I could have spoken. Technically, the room hadn't forbidden it, but the cost of doing so had quietly risen. Saying no would have meant challenging not just the offer, but the structure of the moment itself. As the discussion moved on, I felt myself recede from the center of the decision, repositioned without confrontation. Authority hadn't been asserted loudly, it had been reassigned gently. When the topic changed and laughter returned, I understood that something irreversible had occurred, not because a deal was made, but because a role had been defined. I was no longer someone whose agreement shaped the outcome. I was someone expected to adapt to it. And sitting there, still present, still polite, still married, I understood that what I'd lost wasn't leverage or respect in the obvious sense. I'd lost permission to hesitate, to disagree, to be uncertain, without consequences. And once that permission disappears, it rarely announces itself, it just stops being offered. Have you ever noticed how silence can start to feel intentional only after it's repeated enough times to stop being accidental? That's what followed the dinner, not a conversation, not an argument, not even confusion, but a quiet avoidance that felt practiced rather than uncertain. I waited for the moment when she would circle back, when she'd ask how I felt about what was said or whether I was comfortable with how quickly everything moved. But that moment never arrived. Instead, the days passed with a strange normalcy layered over something unresolved. She spoke about logistics before emotions, outcomes before process, as if the decision itself was already real and my reaction was the variable that needed managing. When I hesitated, she didn't push, but she didn't pause either. There was no, "Are you okay with this?" Only a careful redirection toward what would make things easier, smoother, less awkward for everyone involved. I began to understand that her silence at the table hadn't been shock or hesitation. It had been avoidance. Not avoidance of the offer, but avoidance of choosing a side out loud. By not objecting, she hadn't protected me, she'd allowed the system to speak in her place. And now, in private, that pattern continued. Any attempt to slow things down was met with reassurance rather than alignment. She explained intentions instead of acknowledging impact. She translated their generosity as concern, their assumption as practicality, subtly reframing the situation so that discomfort felt unnecessary, even unreasonable. And the more she explained, the clearer it became that she wasn't undecided, she was already adjusting to the new reality. What unsettled me most wasn't that she disagreed with me, it was that she no longer seemed to feel the need to agree at all. My role had shifted from partner to variable, someone whose reactions needed smoothing rather than understanding. I found myself choosing words carefully, testing the emotional temperature before speaking, aware that pushing too hard would create distance I wasn't sure the marriage could afford. That's when I realized how expensive honesty had become. Silence, meanwhile, was rewarded with calm, with normalcy, with peace. And so I stayed quiet, not because I lacked thoughts, but because the cost of expressing them felt disproportionate. This wasn't betrayal as an act, it was betrayal as a pattern of deflection. No lies were told, no promises were broken, but protection had quietly expired. She wasn't standing against me, but she wasn't standing with me either. And in that space between neutrality and alignment, something essential eroded. I understood then that when someone stops choosing you in moments that require even mild discomfort, love doesn't vanish dramatically, it thins out, becoming procedural, conditional, easier to manage than to defend. And sitting there, watching decisions continue without my consent but with her quiet cooperation, I realized that the most dangerous thing wasn't the offer on the table. It was the realization that I could be bypassed in my own marriage, and nothing would stop it from happening again. By the time I realized how quiet I had become, it didn't feel like silence anymore, it felt like maintenance. I wasn't holding back because I lacked words. I was holding back because words now carried consequences that had nothing to do with truth. Every correction required energy, and every explanation required permission I no longer seemed to have inside my own marriage. When her family spoke about plans, investments, or what made sense going forward, I noticed how my presence was treated less like input and more like confirmation. Not agreement, confirmation. A nod from me wasn't necessary, but my lack of objection was quietly logged as consent. And the strangest part was how normal it began to feel. I stopped preparing counterpoints in my head because I already knew how they would land, not as contributions, but as friction. At home, I'd rehearse sentences I never delivered, not because I feared conflict, but because I'd learned that clarity came at the cost of ease. Each time I considered correcting an assumption, I weighed it against the subtle shift it caused in her tone afterward, the slight withdrawal that followed honesty, the way conversations grew shorter when alignment wasn't immediate. Over time, I realized I wasn't choosing silence, I was choosing the version of the marriage that still functioned. It wasn't love disappearing all at once, it was love being rerouted around discomfort, around defense, around me. I started noticing how decisions were framed as already resolved before I entered the room, how updates replaced discussions, how outcomes arrived without debate. Even when something directly involved me, it was presented as a courtesy, not a collaboration, and I understood, without anyone saying it out loud, that objection would mark me as inefficient, misaligned, difficult. So I adjusted. I responded slower. I asked fewer questions. I learned to absorb conclusions without reaction. This wasn't strategic silence, it was adaptive silence. The kind that develops when participation no longer guarantees belonging. What unsettled me most wasn't their confidence. It was how naturally she adapted to it, not defending them, not opposing me, just translating between worlds that no longer overlapped. She'd soften their language, contextualize their assumptions, explain my restraint in ways that made it easier for everyone else to move on. And in doing so, she unknowingly confirmed what I was already sensing, that alignment had shifted upstream, and my role now was to stay agreeable enough not to disrupt the current. I wasn't angry, I wasn't plotting, I was recalibrating in real time, learning the cost of being fully seen in a space that preferred smoothness over truth. That's when it became clear that nothing dramatic needed to happen for everything to change. The structure was already in place. Decisions would continue. Momentum would build. And unless something interrupted it, my silence would keep being mistaken for approval, until one day, the outcomes no longer recognized me as part of how they were made. And the question that stayed with me wasn't whether I should speak up, but whether the marriage I was protecting still made space for me to be heard at all. The shift didn't announce itself, which is why it took me longer to recognize it. Nothing changed in how people spoke to me directly, they were still polite, still calm, but the way decisions moved around me told a different story. I began noticing that conversations no longer paused when I entered the room, that plans continued uninterrupted, that my presence no longer altered the trajectory of discussion. I wasn't excluded, I was bypassed. Respect hadn't vanished, it had been redistributed, quietly reassigned to structures that no longer required my input. What unsettled me most was how quickly this new arrangement normalized. Invitations became informational instead of participatory. Updates replaced questions. Even when something touched my expertise, it arrived packaged as a conclusion rather than an opening. And I could see, in small procedural ways, how credibility works when it's no longer personal. People deferred to documents, to forecasts, to what made sense, instead of to me. Not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't central anymore. I noticed how she adapted to this shift without comment, adjusting her tone when she relayed information, smoothing edges before they reached me, translating outcomes as inevitabilities instead of choices. It wasn't betrayal in the way people expect it to be. There were no secrets, no confrontations, just an alignment that no longer required defense. When her family spoke with authority, she didn't interrupt, not to support them, not to oppose me, but to keep the flow intact. And in doing so, she mirrored the same recalibration I was experiencing, minimizing friction, preserving ease, letting the system carry weight so no one had to. What changed wasn't how they saw me, it was how necessary I seemed to them. I could feel the subtle shift in social gravity, how attention leaned toward whoever carried momentum, how my opinions became optional rather than essential. Even compliments, when they came, felt historical, acknowledgments of who I had been, not indicators of current relevance. And I understood then that respect doesn't disappear loudly, it dissolves into process. Once decisions can proceed without you, your presence becomes symbolic instead of functional. I didn't resist this realization. I watched it settle, noticing how I, too, began conserving energy, offering less, volunteering fewer insights, choosing when to engage based on whether engagement still mattered. What made it harder wasn't their behavior. It was the absence of intervention from the one person whose alignment once anchored mine. Her silence wasn't disapproval or agreement, it was acceptance of the new normal. And that acceptance carried weight. It confirmed that the recalibration wasn't temporary, that this wasn't a phase to be corrected. It was a system stabilizing. And once systems stabilize, they resist reversal. By the time I understood that, I also understood something else. If respect had shifted without resistance, then whatever came next wouldn't feel like betrayal, it would feel like procedure. And procedures don't ask how you feel before they move forward. I didn't decide to take control because I wanted leverage, I decided because there was a moment when I realized no one was waiting for my response anymore. When decisions arrived already shaped, already softened, already positioned as efficient conclusions rather than open questions. It happened gradually, then all at once, the way patterns do when you finally see them clearly, meetings summarized instead of discussed, plans framed as necessities, alignment spoken of as something that had already been achieved. Even at home, the language shifted so subtly it felt unreasonable to resist. My wife saying, "They've already settled it," or "It just makes sense this way." Not defensively, not dismissively, just with the calm certainty of someone who no longer felt the need to pause. That was the moment I understood that waiting had become a form of agreement. And silence was no longer neutral, it was being read as consent. The decision to buy in came after that realization, not as a reaction, but as an acknowledgement that the structure had already moved past me. There was no dramatic timing, no confrontation that forced my hand. It was simply clear that if I remained exactly where I was, I would still be included, but only as a formality. The transaction itself was quiet, procedural, almost indifferent, the kind of administrative shift that systems absorb without comment. And what unsettled me most was how easily it happened. How readily the system accepted my capital in ways it had never accepted my voice. I didn't announce it or hint at it, because this wasn't about being seen, it was about stopping the erosion before it hardened into permanence. At home, nothing changed right away, and that absence of reaction carried its own weight. No recalibration, no curiosity, no sudden awareness that something had shifted beneath the surface. That was when the truth settled fully. The marriage was no longer the place where power, influence, or protection were negotiated. It had become a space where outcomes were managed after the fact. I wasn't reclaiming importance, I was trying to remain legible. The control I gained didn't feel like strength. It felt like insulation, a thin layer separating me from becoming entirely optional. And even as I signed the documents, I understood something with quiet finality. Whatever authority this secured professionally, it would not restore what had already been lost relationally. You can formalize influence, You can enter rooms through ownership rather than invitation. But none of that compels someone to choose you again once they've learned how to move forward without you. And as I waited to see how this change would surface, I already sensed the answer wouldn't arrive as confrontation or gratitude, but as confirmation of how thoroughly my absence had already been normalized. The reveal didn't arrive as a moment, it arrived as an adjustment. And I remember noticing it not in words but in my body first. The way my breath stalled for half a second when a conversation paused longer than expected. The way someone's eyes didn't slide past me the way they used to. Nothing had been announced. Nothing had been explained. The room simply hesitated, as if recalibrating an assumption it hadn't realized it was making. That was when I understood something had shifted. The paperwork confirmed it later, moving through channels the way internal documents always do, clean, unemotional, stripped of story, a percentage finalized, a line item clarified, authority formalized without ceremony. What followed wasn't shock or praise, but repositioning. People waited now, language softened by a fraction. Decisions that once arrived complete now paused, briefly, as if checking alignment. No one apologized for how I'd been spoken around before. Because systems don't reconcile backward, they just update and proceed. The unsettling part wasn't how smoothly it was accepted, but how little explanation it required. It felt as though the earlier version of me had always been provisional, a placeholder the structure had quietly replaced the moment it became inconvenient. Even before I brought it home, I sensed how my wife would receive it, not with surprise, but with recognition. When she finally understood what had changed, her reaction arrived as a pause that stretched just long enough to register. A stillness that wasn't confusion but recalculation. She didn't ask when or why. She didn't celebrate or retreat. She simply went quiet in a way that felt different from before. As if she were reconciling two versions of me she realized she'd never held at the same time. That pause landed harder than anything else. The reveal didn't restore intimacy or reopen ground between us. It clarified how much had already been operating without my presence. Professionally, doors opened with a polite efficiency that felt procedural rather than warm. Respect returning in a calibrated form that depended on structure, not memory. Personally, nothing reopened. No warmth rushed back into the room. No sudden realignment toward partnership. The marriage had already stopped being the place where power, or protection, was negotiated at all. What I'd gained didn't feel like leverage. It felt like containment. A way to prevent further loss rather than reclaim what had already been spent. And what lingered most was how quickly everything stabilized around the new configuration. How easily the world adapted as if this version of events had always been inevitable. There was no sense of victory in that, only a quiet, unsettling clarity. Recognition, when delayed long enough, doesn't arrive as validation, it arrives as confirmation of distance. The truth didn't undo what had happened while I was being underestimated. It simply proved how much had already been decided in my absence. What came after the reveal wasn't fallout, it was recalculation. And that distinction mattered more than I expected. Nothing unraveled. No one scrambled. The system didn't panic or apologize for having moved without me. It simply adjusted its math and kept going. Meetings resumed with the same agenda, just slightly reweighted. Timelines didn't reset, they tightened. Where my input had once been optional, it was now anticipated, but only within the boundaries that had already been drawn. I noticed how conversations began to include me earlier, not because anyone suddenly trusted me, but because excluding me now carried procedural cost. That realization landed quietly and stayed. This wasn't restoration, it was optimization. The respect I was experiencing wasn't personal, it was functional, and that made it oddly cold. At home, the change registered differently. My wife didn't interrogate the shift or question how long this version of me had existed. She adjusted her posture around it, the way people do when furniture is rearranged in a familiar room. Her tone became careful without becoming warm. She listened more closely, but not more deeply. It was as if the marriage had learned how to accommodate a new variable without revisiting its original design. I found myself watching these micro-adjustments with a kind of detached attention. noticing how quickly everything stabilized once the uncertainty was removed. That was the part that unsettled me most, the speed of it. The earlier tension hadn't come from conflict. It had come from ambiguity. And now that ambiguity was gone, the system knew where to place me, so did the family, and in a way that was harder to name, so did my wife. There were moments when I considered whether this was the point where things were supposed to feel better, where clarity was meant to soften what had been lost. Instead, clarity sharpened it. I could see, with uncomfortable precision, how much of my earlier invisibility had been tolerated because it made everything else easier. The recalibration didn't erase that history. It confirmed it. I wasn't angry, and that surprised me. What I felt was narrower, an awareness that every future interaction would now be filtered through this updated understanding. That the version of me who'd been quietly dismissed couldn't return, but neither could the version of the marriage that might have protected him. Even affection, when it appeared, felt cautious, as though it were being offered under new terms that no one had said out loud. I began to understand that this was what equilibrium looked like after erosion, not collapse, not confrontation, but a stable arrangement built around what remained useful. The danger wasn't that I'd been underestimated, it was that once corrected, nothing else needed to change. The recalculation closed something I hadn't realized was still open, the possibility that recognition might heal. Instead, it drew a clean line between influence and intimacy. And I could feel myself standing firmly on only one side of it. And as the days moved forward with seamless efficiency, one question kept returning, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently: if everything functions better now, what exactly was lost to make that possible? What followed didn't feel like loss at first. It felt like refinement. Everything still worked. Conversations continued. Schedules stayed full. And from the outside, nothing appeared damaged, but the space I occupied inside those routines had subtly narrowed. And the first sign wasn't emotional, it was habitual. I reached for my phone one morning to share a thought I would have once sent without thinking, then stopped halfway through typing, not because I was afraid of the response, but because I could already predict it. It would be calm, appreciative, final. That pause lingered longer than it should have, and when I deleted the message, something small but familiar disappeared with it. That was how it happened, not through confrontation, but through repetition. Decisions began arriving already settled, framed as updates rather than discussions. The language was cooperative, almost considerate, but it carried an unspoken assumption: input was no longer required to proceed. When I spoke, the room adjusted politely and moved on, as if my role had shifted from participant to confirmation. No one interrupted me, no one dismissed me, they simply incorporated my presence without needing it. The unsettling part was how reasonable it all felt. There was no friction to push against, no line to point to and say, this is where it changed. At home, the same logic echoed in smaller, quieter ways. My wife didn't argue or withdraw. She adapted, she listened, nodded, and then acted as though the acknowledgement itself had completed the exchange. Plans unfolded smoothly, efficiently, with fewer questions than before. It wasn't avoidance, it was optimization. The marriage began to feel managed rather than shared, maintained through seamless handoffs instead of negotiation. I noticed myself choosing words more carefully, trimming instincts before they reached my mouth, not to keep the peace but to preserve momentum. Ease had become the metric, and anything that slowed it, even closeness, felt negotiable. What unsettled me most was realizing she seemed to sense the shift before I fully named it. There was a new hesitation in her attention, a brief pause before responding, as if she were checking an internal outline of who I was allowed to be in each situation. Not mistrust, recalibration, and with that recalibration, something quietly expired. She stopped looking to me for the kind of confirmation that isn't procedural, the glance that asks, are we aligned? Not is this workable? It wasn't that she stopped caring. It was that caring had been reorganized around what functioned best. I started noticing how often I chose silence without being asked, not out of resignation, but calculation. Speaking felt optional in a system that already knew how it wanted to proceed. Silence, I learned, wasn't demanded, it was rewarded. It kept things smooth, predictable, acceptable, and once a system learns it can rely on your restraint, it stops checking whether that restraint costs you anything. The realization didn't arrive with anger or grief, just clarity. I wasn't being edged out or replaced. I was being held in a stable position, useful, agreeable, increasingly peripheral. What changed wasn't behavior but assumption. I had been reclassified into a version of myself that no longer required renewal to remain intact. And once standing settles into structure, it stops responding to intention. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about misunderstanding or timing anymore. It was about permanence quietly taking shape. One reasonable adjustment at a time. Have you ever noticed how something doesn't hurt when it ends, but hurts when you realize it no longer expects you? That was the shift I couldn't ignore anymore. Not because anything new happened, but because things that used to involve me simply didn't. Conversations continued without the small pause that used to wait for my input. Decisions were shared with me after they were already shaped, already safe, already complete. It wasn't exclusion in the obvious sense. It was smoother than that, efficient, as if my presence had become optional without anyone needing to say so. I caught myself preparing opinions that never found a place to land, rehearsing thoughts that expired quietly before they were needed. And the strangest part was how quickly my body learned. I stopped leaning forward, stopped listening for openings, stopped assuming there would be room. Not because I was angry, but because the room had learned how to function without adjusting for me. That's when I understood the cost of everything settling. Once roles stabilize, they don't push back anymore. They don't test themselves. They don't check for errors. They just repeat. Even at home, the rhythm had changed. My wife didn't avoid me. She didn't argue. She simply moved with the new shape of things. Plans were phrased as updates instead of questions. Explanations replaced discussions. I noticed it in the smallest moments, when she filled a silence I used to fill, when she answered on my behalf without looking over first, when decisions arrived already wrapped in reasonableness. There was no hostility in it. That's what made it harder to name, because how do you confront something that feels cooperative? How do you object to something that's working? I realized then that recognition had shifted from something I was granted to something I was no longer expected to need. And once that happens, asking for it feels like asking to be reassessed. I tried, once, to step back into a conversation the way I used to slow it down, to reinsert myself, and the moment passed like I hadn't spoken at all. Not ignored, absorbed, neutralized, as if my contribution was already accounted for somewhere upstream. That was the cost no one talks about. Not losing access, losing relevance, not being silenced, but being anticipated away. I could feel my instincts recalibrating, my expectations lowering without permission, my sense of authority shrinking to fit what was being offered. And I understood something quietly devastating. Nothing had to be taken from me for this to happen. All that was required was consistency. Enough repetition that my absence became part of the design. Enough calm that no one felt responsible. Enough time that it no longer felt reversible. That's when it became clear, this wasn't about power, or money, or even betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was about what disappears when you stop being chosen in real time. Because love doesn't vanish when people leave. It vanishes when the world learns how to move forward without checking if you're still in the room. And once that lesson is learned, the cost doesn't announce itself. It just keeps charging, quietly, efficiently, every time you realize you no longer reach for a place that no longer waits for you. There was no moment where I decided to change how I showed up. It happened the way habits do when they stop being useful, quietly and without ceremony. The first sign being that I no longer felt the reflex to explain myself when assumptions formed in front of me. I noticed it in small, ordinary ways, how I listened longer before responding, how I waited to see if anyone would actually ask for my input instead of offering it automatically, how I let pauses stretch without rushing to fill them the way I used to. Nothing dramatic had shifted on the surface. But something inside me had recognized that participation was no longer neutral. That every word I volunteered was being sorted somewhere else. Evaluated not for truth but for convenience. So I adjusted. Not out of strategy or resentment, but because continuing as before felt like placing myself back into a position I'd already been moved out of. I stopped correcting timelines. I stopped clarifying intent. I let conversations finish without adding the final note that used to feel necessary. And what surprised me wasn't that no one objected, it was how quickly the room adapted. As if my reduced presence made everything run more smoothly. Decisions arrived already summarized. Updates came framed as conclusions. When I was included, it was after alignment had settled, not while it was forming. And that was the moment I understood that absence wasn't being noticed because it had already been accounted for. Even at home, the rhythm changed in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Plans were discussed with a certainty that didn't leave room for negotiation. Questions were asked after choices had been made, and I found myself nodding not because I agreed, but because disagreement no longer had a place to land. It wasn't that my wife disagreed with me, worse than that. She had learned how to proceed without needing my agreement at all, and the efficiency of that adaptation made it feel reasonable, even kind. I felt the cost most clearly in the moments where I caught myself preparing to speak and then stopping, not out of fear, but because I already knew how it would be received, acknowledged politely, incorporated selectively, and ultimately overridden by whatever alignment had already formed elsewhere. That's when I realized this wasn't marginalization anymore. It was a new equilibrium, one that didn't require conflict to sustain itself. I began choosing my silences carefully, not as a protest, but as a form of self-preservation, because offering less meant losing less, and withholding felt safer than being reinterpreted after the fact. The unsettling part wasn't that people treated me differently, it was that they treated me consistently. As if a quieter version of me had been agreed upon and distributed, and everyone was simply responding to that outline. I hadn't been pushed out, I had been optimized away, and once I saw that, I understood something else too. This wasn't about being ignored, it was about being anticipated. The system no longer waited to hear from me because it believed it already knew what I would say. And when that belief takes hold, presence stops being required. I didn't leave the room. But I felt the moment when the room stopped adjusting for me, and as that pattern settled, one question stayed with me, heavier than any argument could have been: what becomes possible for everyone else once your absence is no longer accidental, but expected? The moment that made it undeniable wasn't dramatic or public. It happened in a space that used to feel shared, in a decision that used to include me by default. We were standing in the kitchen, talking about something ordinary. Schedules, commitments, the quiet logistics of a life that still functioned, and she mentioned a plan that had already been set in motion. Not proposed, not discussed, already arranged. I remember nodding instinctively, the way you do when something sounds reasonable, and then feeling the delay catch up to me half a second later. That brief internal pause where I realized I hadn't actually been part of choosing it. I asked a neutral question, nothing challenging. Just enough to locate myself in the process. And she answered calmly, efficiently, as if clarifying a detail rather than responding to a partner. That was when I noticed the shift in her tone, not cold, not defensive, just practiced. She wasn't excluding me, she was informing me, and the difference between those two things landed heavier than any argument could have. I felt a flicker of embarrassment then, not because I'd been dismissed, but because I'd assumed something that was no longer true, that proximity still meant participation. I stood there listening as she explained how it had already been handled, how it made sense, how everyone involved was comfortable with it, and I realized the word "we" hadn't come up once, not because she was avoiding it, but because she no longer needed it to justify forward motion. What unsettled me wasn't the plan itself, but how smoothly it existed without me. How easily my agreement had become optional, something nice to have but no longer structurally necessary. I saw myself from the outside in that moment, not diminished, not erased, just repositioned, present, competent, but no longer central. I recognized the professionalism in her approach. The same professionalism that had replaced intimacy elsewhere. And I understood that this was what adaptation looked like when it hardened, not cruelty, but efficiency, not betrayal, but quiet optimization. I didn't argue. I didn't object. I felt the old impulse rise and dissolve just as quickly, because objecting would have required reopening a space that no longer existed. Instead, I nodded again, slower this time, aware that something had closed behind that gesture. Later, alone, I replayed the moment not with anger, but with clarity, and that was worse. There was no misunderstanding to correct, no apology to wait for, no confrontation to prepare. The system, both inside the marriage and around it, had already learned how to proceed without friction. And friction, I realized, was the only place my presence used to matter. I wasn't being pushed out, I was being worked around. And once that becomes the preferred method, intimacy doesn't end loudly, it expires quietly. Standing there afterward, in a room that still looked the same, I understood that this wasn't about losing influence in a single decision. It was about realizing that future decisions would follow this shape too, and that the most consequential thing that had changed wasn't what she chose, but what she no longer needed to check before choosing. I didn't decide to withdraw so much as I stopped correcting the assumption that I no longer needed to be fully present. And the moment that change settled, it came with a strange dual sensation, relief paired with disorientation, like setting down a weight you didn't realize had been shaping your posture. I spoke less, not out of restraint, but because I noticed how often my words arrived after conclusions were already formed. I stopped offering context, stopped filling pauses that no longer invited me in, and for the first time, I let conversations end without making sure they landed safely. There was an unexpected ease in that, freedom, even, but it was accompanied by a quiet loss of orientation. The subtle question of where exactly I was supposed to stand now that no one seemed to need me in the middle. I began coming home at irregular times, not to test reactions, but because my arrival no longer felt like a hinge moment in the household's rhythm. And the most unsettling part was how smoothly everything adjusted. Meals still appeared, schedules still aligned, decisions still moved forward with a calm efficiency that didn't pause for my input. When my wife noticed the change, it wasn't concern that crossed her face, it was assumption. She started speaking in summaries instead of questions, updating me on decisions already made, occasionally answering for me when someone else asked. Not maliciously, just practically, as if my reduced presence had clarified something for her. Once, she told someone I'd be fine with whatever works, without checking, and I realized that wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a conclusion drawn from my silence. I felt it register in my body before my mind caught up, a pause in the doorway, a hesitation before sitting down, the fading instinct to explain myself preemptively. Conversations grew shorter, eye contact less deliberate, and questions that once found their way to me now took other routes without looping back. No one objected to my withdrawal, which is how I knew it wasn't being read as distance or protest. It was being read as resolution. The system didn't resist my absence, it absorbed it. And that absorption came with a quiet reclassification of who I was allowed to be. I saw how adaptability, when practiced long enough, teaches people they can plan around you instead of with you. I had been maintaining access, not intimacy, and once I stopped doing that work, nothing rushed in to replace it. That was the inflection point, not anger, not grief, but the realization that my presence had been optional for longer than I'd admitted. There was a moment, small but unmistakable, when I noticed my wife had stopped checking whether I was included and started assuming I didn't need to be. And that assumption went unchallenged, not because I agreed with it, but because challenging it felt like asking to be reinserted into a structure that had already moved on. What changed inside me then wasn't resolve, but orientation. I stopped preparing to be misunderstood. I stopped anticipating how to make myself easier to accommodate. I became aware of how much energy had been spent preserving relevance in a space that now valued smoothness over presence. And as that awareness settled, I understood something that would matter later. My absence wasn't going to stay invisible. It would be interpreted. It would be assigned meaning. And whatever meaning others attached to it would shape what they felt entitled to do next, without asking whether I was still there to consent. Absence doesn't announce itself as a problem. It settles in quietly and lets other people finish the sentence for you. By the time I realized my withdrawal had been interpreted, not noticed, the interpretation had already hardened into expectation. Decisions started reaching me as confirmations instead of conversations. And then, eventually, not at all, I wasn't excluded in the dramatic sense, no doors closed, no meetings moved, but my involvement was treated like an inefficiency that had been thoughtfully removed. What surprised me wasn't how quickly this happened, but how reasonable everyone seemed while doing it. Language shifted first. People spoke faster around me, with fewer qualifiers, as if explaining would slow things down. My wife began using phrases like, "We already handled it," and "it made sense to move forward." And I understood that the "we" no longer included me by default. There was no tension in her voice, no guilt, just relief at reduced friction. I could feel the system recalibrating in small, unmistakable ways, chairs chosen without checking where I'd sit, timelines set without asking about my availability. Assumptions made about my agreement because disagreement had become statistically unlikely. Once, someone apologized for forgetting to loop me in, then immediately added, "But it worked out, right?" and waited for my nod, not my answer. I gave it, and that was the moment something irretrievable slipped into place. My compliance didn't read as grace, it read as endorsement. The more consistently I stayed quiet, the more confidently others built on that quiet. I watched how my wife adjusted, too, not away from me, but around me. She stopped bracing for my reactions, stopped anticipating my perspective, stopped scanning my face for alignment. Instead, she mirrored the room, matching its pace, its confidence, its conclusions, and I saw, with unsettling clarity, that my withdrawal had made her life simpler, not lonelier. That realization didn't hurt in the way betrayal is supposed to hurt. It settled like a weight in my chest, steady and unmoving. I began to notice the absence of small negotiations, the micro moments where intimacy used to live. No more, "What do you think?" No more, "Should we wait?" Those questions had been replaced by forward motion. And forward motion doesn't look back unless something blocks it. I wasn't blocking anything anymore. What finally landed wasn't resentment, but recognition. My silence had been reinterpreted as consent. And consent, once assumed, doesn't need renewal. I understood then that whatever space I had stepped out of had already been repurposed. My role hadn't been stolen. It had been optimized away. And the most disorienting part was how normal this all felt to everyone else. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just a smooth continuation that didn't require me to re-enter. I could feel the last illusion dissolving, that withdrawal was neutral, that absence could be temporary, that I could step back in when ready. Systems don't wait for readiness, they reward predictability, and I had become predictable in my silence, standing there, watching plans move forward without resistance. I realized this wasn't the end of the marriage, but it was the end of something quieter and harder to name. The assumption that my presence mattered enough to be checked. Whatever came next wouldn't arrive as a confrontation. It would arrive as a conclusion others felt entitled to reach on my behalf. Endings don't announce themselves. They arrive as a quiet lack of resistance. By the time I understood that nothing else was going to change, there was no shock attached to the realization. Just a calm recognition that the story had already closed its doors without asking whether I wanted to step through them. The systems were stable, the routines were efficient, and the marriage had found a way to continue without needing anything further from me. What surprised me wasn't the absence of conflict, it was how little effort it took to stop reaching once I noticed no one was reaching back. There was one moment, small enough to miss, where something familiar no longer felt available, not gone, just unreachable. A shared reflex that didn't activate, a glance that didn't carry expectation anymore. That's when I understood that nothing here would be renegotiated, no matter how clearly it was named. My wife didn't withdraw in any dramatic way. She remained composed, functional, attentive to what needed to move forward. If she sensed the finality of my silence, she didn't challenge it, and I didn't ask her to. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally saw that we had both adapted in ways that made repair unnecessary to the system we were living inside. Her calm wasn't indifference, it was alignment. And mine, eventually, became acceptance. There was no villain in that realization, just two people adjusting to a structure that no longer asked us to protect each other. I didn't leave in anger. I didn't demand understanding. I simply stopped offering presence where it had become optional. And the strange thing was how quickly everything adjusted around that choice, as if it had been anticipated. What remained after that wasn't bitterness or relief, but clarity, a narrowing of attention. I began noticing how much energy returns when you stop translating yourself for spaces that have already decided who you are. How quiet becomes restorative when it's chosen instead of endured. I understood then that staying visible in places where your voice no longer alters outcomes doesn't preserve connection, it teaches people how little you're required. That realization didn't feel like loss at first. It felt like accuracy, and accuracy has a way of ending stories cleanly, without spectacle. Some endings don't hurt because they're dramatic. They hurt because they're precise, because they confirm what you've been sensing for a long time, and remove the last reason to doubt yourself. I didn't walk away from love. Love stopped asking for me in the room, and I finally believed what that meant. The story didn't conclude with justice or reconciliation. It concluded with the absence of argument inside me, and when that happens, you don't need closure, you've already stepped out of the question. If this story left you quiet instead of satisfied, you're not alone. Some stories don't end to entertain us, they end to be recognized. And if this one felt familiar, there's another you may want to watch next. It explores accusation instead of silence, and how discovering the truth too late can change everything you thought you were protecting. Watch My Wife Accused Me, What I Found Out Later Changed Everything, if you want to. Continue exploring how love unravels not through explosions, but through moments no one thinks to stop.